Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, chers étudiants, au nom de l'Institut d'études européennes de l'ULB et de ses facultés partenaires, la faculté de droit et de criminologie, la faculté de philosophie et sciences sociales et la faculté Solvay, la directrice de l'Institut d'études européennes, Ramona Coman, et moi-même sommes ravis de pouvoir vous accueillir pour la rentrée académique en études européennes 2017-2018. We are delighted to welcome you all to the opening lecture of the academic year in European Studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. As you know, our institute is marked by its interdisciplinary nature, which is particularly clear and visible when taking a look at our teaching programs, at our research projects, and other activities. 4 main disciplines are indeed present in our, I would say, DNA: economics, law, political sciences, and history. Chaque année, c'est une de ces disciplines qui est mise en exergue lors de la rentrée académique en études européennes. Cette année, c'est le tour de l'histoire. Et nous sommes très honorés que nos collègues historiens de la faculté de philosophie et sciences sociales, et en particulier le professeur Nicolas Verschuren, aient accepté de co-organiser cet événement. Nous sommes d'autant plus heureux qu'ils ont choisi le thème du Brexit, qui sera bien entendu abordé du point de vue de l'historien, qu'est le professeur Kiran Patel de l'Université de Maastricht. C'est évidemment là un sujet d'une brûlante actualité, comme en témoigne d'ailleurs le sommet européen d'aujourd'hui et de demain. C'est aussi un thème qui transcende véritablement nos disciplines respectives. Il y a 2 ans, dans cette même salle, nous avions d'ailleurs consacré notre conférence inaugurale à ce qui n'était encore à l'époque que la perspective du Brexit, mais du point de vue des sciences politiques, à l'initiative du professeur Mario Tello. This conference fits clearly within the Institut d'études européennes tradition of public engagement. Indeed, it echoes one of the Institute's main purposes as a forum for public debates on important and topical European issues. The subject matter of this evening's talk is certainly one of the key challenges of the EU in the years to come. In this context, the historical perspective is, of course, of main interest for a better understanding of the problem. Nous souhaitons remercier chaleureusement le professeur Kiran Patel d'avoir accepté notre invitation, de même bien entendu que nos co-organisateurs dans cet événement, donc le département d'histoire de la faculté de philosophie et sciences sociales, et tout particulièrement le professeur Nicolas Verschuren, à qui je passe immédiatement la parole.
Sorry. I promised to my student that I record the session today. So, good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure, really, it's a great pleasure to welcome Kiran Patel for the opening of the academic year of the Institute of European Studies. I will start with a few words about our guest, and then I will leave him the floor for a lecture on the historical dimension of the Brexit. After that, I will open the discussion with some very broad reflection on the historical dimension of European integration. This is mainly for my students. We asked to pass the test in January, and then we are free to ask questions, comments, and even suggestions. So we are very lucky to have Kiran Patel for this lecture. Actually, and I think I can say that just between us, he's actually one of the greatest contemporary historians in Europe. As his field of study, Kiran Patel has crossed frontiers, seas, oceans, from Germany to Italy, from the Netherlands to the United States. From 2002 to 2006, he was assistant professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Then he joined the European University Institute in Florence for 5 years. After that, he started a new challenge and became professor of global and European history at the Maastricht University, where he holds the Jean Monnet chair. Let me add a few words about his field of research and his main publication. First, I would like to mention his book, Soldiers of Labor, which is the English version of his PhD thesis, and it was published in 2005. In this stimulating research, Kiran Patel dares to propose a convincing comparison of labor policy between Nazi regime and the New Deal. It's even more than a comparison. It's a transnational history from the Nazi labor policy to the Roosevelt New Deal. Second, his most recent book is The New Deal, A Global History, which was just released 2 years ago. In this book, Kiran Patel underlines, of course, the global dimension of the New Deal, but most importantly, his struggle to get out the idea of American exceptionalism about the policy of the New Deals and how transnational networks and ideas are clearly linked during the 30s. Finally, I will point this book, it's also mainly for my student. It's a collective book from a conference held in 2009 and on the historical dimension of the CAP. And in this book, you will find some very interesting hints to undertake new research on this crucial European policy, which it's clearly for you off-putting, I think, but it's really so important for the economic and social history of European integration. So I have talked enough, and I leave the floor to Kiran. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students, I'm delighted to be here today. It's lovely to be back in Brussels and to speak to you on this very special occasion. And I hope I deserve also the kind words that have been said already in kind of introducing me. I say that I will speak to you as a historian today, though as one who really also enjoys working in an interdisciplinary context, and I will try to shed light and discuss the history, or the hidden prehistories, I should say, of Brexit from such kind of a perspective. And I'm trying thus to live up to the spirit of your institute here, where, as we've already heard, the 4 disciplines cooperate in also trying to elucidate and understand what European integration and study is basically all about. I will also say that I presume still that at the end of this talk, the various tribes probably gathered in this room, that is the economists, the political scientists, the historians, the lawyers, and all the others, will probably be equally unhappy. Because for the historians, I will do something that historians normally do not do, and that is to try to learn and to draw lessons from the past for the situation that we're in today. Now, the political scientists will probably be unhappy because there's not going to be a lot of theory in my talk. The economists will miss the mathematical formula in my second slide, which will also not have. So there is many reasons why this basically will not fully work. But if you will, the topic of Brexit is maybe also one that invites questions of frustration. So I hope that at least is something that is in sync with the topic that we're discussing. And I hope that I will, at least if you are feeling a level of frustration, compensate that by addressing you, the students in this room, at the very end with a rather personal note. Now, of course, there is many different prehistories of Brexit that one could talk about. And let me first say what I will not do in the next minutes. I will not talk to you about the long history of what is often called the British dissatisfaction with EU membership. I will come back to that a little bit in passing, but also try to shed different light on it than many people to do today. I will not so much talk about Maggie Thatcher or other minutes or moments where Britons were unhappy with the EU. I would rather want to do something else, and that is really to talk about other cases of countries, not full-fledged member states, I'll come to that in a moment, withdrawing from the European Union. I think that this is interesting for several reasons, and this is something that I first want to discuss a little bit from a more conceptual perspective and look at this from the perspective of European studies generally. I think it is interesting to discuss these points because it raises fundamental questions about how we study, how we understand the European Union and, of course, its predecessors. I agree, for instance, with scholars such as Annegret Epler and Henrik Scheller, who have recently argued, and this is a little my 2 minutes for the political scientists in the room, if you will, who've argued that existing explanations of European integration tend to have an affirmative spin and a normative bias, according to which disintegration is actually not seen as an option, neither empirically nor from a more normative vantage point. Recently, some efforts to conceptualize disintegration in the context of the EU have been started, for instance by Philip Schmitter on EU functionalism as the theory of disintegration, or by Hans Vollard in the Netherlands. But from all I'm aware of, I think there is still rather little on the conceptual level about the predecessors of the Brexit situation that we find ourselves in, also from political science, even if some of the cases that I will mention and elaborate on have also been mentioned in passing in the existing literature, for instance, by lawyers, of course, before Brexit happened, and I feel also that the weight of what they mean for integration has not really been put front and center. That is maybe also something that we can return to in the Q&A. I will also return to it towards the end of this lecture. Now, secondly, speaking for a few moments to the historians in the room, I think that this talk could also be of interest for those historians who, as most historians I should say, find integration history, the history of the EU, boring and dull, basically. International history, that is the history of countries in their cooperation and working together, the international relations between countries, was in crisis for a number of years, but I think it is now alive and kicking again, and there is many historians who think that there is new things to be studied, like the issues, for instance, such as human rights or humanitarian aid, but still I think there is comparably few who would also think that the history of European integration is a particularly interesting topic amongst historians. Still, I would argue that with this talk, I'm trying to show that some of the concerns that also historians with other specializations have can also be integrated in and latched on to European integration history. Not only the history of the Cold War, not only the history of kind of the superpowers, but also what has become more interesting recently, the history of how the global North and the global South interacted in the 20th century, a history of international capitalism, a history of a non-Eurocentric Europe, and also hence the links between European and global history and colonialism and empire even, that are topics that I try to touch upon in my talk. This was a little bit a conceptual introduction, so I now want to tell you finally properly what my paper is going to be about. It's about the histories of Algeria and Greenland, a country of which you've thought a lot so far in your life, I presume, which left again the European community, because we're talking about the pre-Maastricht, the pre-EU period, in 1962 and in 1985, respectively. I will not in this talk, for this specific audience that we're here today, want to analyze these cases in their own right. I'm not trying to talk to you as a historian today, but rather what I'm trying to do is to draw lessons from these cases for Brexit and for where we stand today. Again, I'll say more about the two cases in a minute, but before I start, I think, of course, I have to underline also as a historian some of the fundamental differences that separate us from the periods of study that I will refer to in a moment. And I think there's mainly three things that separate us from that situation that I will be speaking about in a moment. Firstly, I want to say that, of course, integration, the EC/EU, has come a long way since the 1960s or even since the 1980s, by having acquired many new powers since then, particularly with the Maastricht and the Lisbon Treaty. And therefore, we also have to be careful, if we want to draw lessons, that we don't get this wrong because of the fundamental differences between what the EU is as a creature, if you will, now in comparison to those early periods. Secondly, and very closely linked, it is also, of course, very important to say that the United Kingdom is a very different animal in comparison to the two countries that I will talk to about. in its role in Europe. Of course, it is a full-fledged member state. I'll come back to that in a moment. But also, if you just look at it from an economic, from a political, even from a military vantage point, of course, it plays a fundamentally different role than the two countries that I will speak about. And thirdly, I think we're living also today in a very different world than the world of the 1960s and 80s, a world that back then was still defined and I think also made somewhat more static by the Cold War divide, where things, at least to some observers looking back today, seemed more easy to understand, whereas now we're living in a much more multipolar world, where the question is also what European integration means and what it stands in a global context looks different than it did at the time. So what I'm trying to do is, when looking back to these two cases, not directly apply history. I'm not saying that there is one consistent historical lesson that we can apply one-to-one to the present-day situation. You will also see that history has different lessons for us for these two cases. But I think that if we extrapolate from them and try to see what kind of broader parameters there are, we can still embark into that less mechanical and maybe slightly more creative exercise of trying to learn from the past. This is at least what I would like to invite you to do with me tonight. Okay, the United Kingdom is not the first full-fledged, it is the first full-fledged member state that has ever decided to withdraw from the European Union. Of course, it hasn't done so, as we all know. There is only the decision and the negotiations at the moment. But my point is with this talk that it is not the first country to do so. While the case of Greenland, an autonomous part of Denmark, which left the European Community, the EC, in 1985, is sometimes referred to also in public discussions about Brexit, other cases are hardly ever known, I would argue. And this has to do with Algeria in 1965, which, again, 62, only 5 years after the Treaties of Rome, decided to take the same step as part of its independence from France. And despite all the ongoing discussions about Brexit or Grexit a few years ago and other scenarios of our time, even few EU experts really know that the Caribbean island of Saint-Barthélemy, a French overseas territory, it's still going the right way, has changed its status from a French overseas collectivity in 2012 to, and this is of course EU jargon that all of you know by heart, to an outermost region of the European Union that is part of the overseas countries or territories. So in that sense, it's also there that we see changes in its relationship to the European Union. Now, today I want to discuss the lessons that we can draw from this exit, as I will call it, and the Green Six of exit of 1985, as these two cases are particularly interesting because these are the bigger places where also we can already look at the medium and long-term implications and consequences of withdrawal. And this is also where I've looked at archival material to really bring something new and where I think, again, we can learn for the situation today. My argument in a nutshell is to say that there is a much more complex relationship between integration and processes of disintegration than we have thought so far. That, again, this interrelationship is a much more permanent feature of European integration than existing researchers had it. And if you also want to have more precise arguments, I will highlight too that firstly, and I think this is maybe also a bit of relief, if, for instance, you read today's Politico, where there were two very critical articles of what might happen in the United Kingdom in March 2019, that the argument now being the moment of exit, that one moment is maybe less important than we now tend to think, and that basically what you then have as a deal is often, as history will tell us, as I will tell you in a moment, is often only the deal before the next deal. And the other argument, of course, is that I want to challenge with my talk some of the sovereignist rhetoric that the exit camp has often applied and demonstrate with these historical examples that we need something to see more in EU-UK negotiations, that again, the international links between the UK and the EU run so deep and are so important that at least the slogan of fully trying to regain control, one that you will remember from the Brexit campaign, is absolutely misleading. Now, this takes me into the first part of my presentation, and I've tried to use topics that are all familiar to us because they come from the discussions that we have seen recently. And in this first part, I want to talk about the motives that drove the leave camp discussions and the negotiations in these earlier cases. Now, the stakes were high and the message was clear. During the referendum campaign, the leading representative of the leave camp argued that his island was actually very special, and I quote him, with regard to language, culture, the economy, and the social structure. To uphold, again, this is a quote, these characteristic traits of our country, it was vitally important to disentangle the ties with Brussels. What might sound to us like somebody like Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom context were in fact the words of this man whom you see here, Greenland's Jonathan Motzfeldt, prior to the referendum on this island in 1982. On the largest island of the world, with a population, of course, of only some 50,000 inhabitants, dissatisfaction with the EC had been gaining momentum for quite some time at that point in history. Economic arguments centering on the EC's common fishery policies as a challenge to the island's most important economic factor coalesced with debates about identity. Already in 1972, when the Kingdom of Denmark, and of course again Greenland was part of Denmark, held an EC membership referendum, 70% of these 50,000 Greenlanders opted against accession, but their vote was overruled by the big majority in the Kingdom of Denmark itself. Back then, there had been little that Greenland could do. In 1979, however, Denmark granted home rule to Greenland, and on this basis, the island launched an EC membership referendum, which ultimately led it then to withdraw from the European community 3 years after this referendum, i.e. in 1985. Sovereignty, self-determination, and the desire to take back control played an even bigger role in the Algerian case that I will now briefly turn to. The country entered the EC, and that is very important, as part of France. When the Treaty of Rome in 1957 was signed, France still held vast colonial possessions, and the links between metropolitan France and Algeria were particularly strong, as many of you will know. Article 227 of the EEC Treaty stipulated that most of the treaty's regulation also applied to the North African country, which thus became part of the original community of the 6 member states, again due to French colonialism. The Algerian War of Independence, which for 8 long years with hundreds of thousands of people dead and many more eventually forced to flee the country, was of course mainly about shaking off the yoke of French rule. But, unsurprisingly, the Front de Libération Nationale, the FNL, LN, also wanted to cut the connections with the EC. Looking back a few months after the independence had been won, Algeria's first president, Ahmed Ben Bella, you will see him on one of the next slides, deplored in his speech, and I quote him, the past 300 years of colonial domination, and he also heavily criticized the EC, particularly its nascent agriculture policy. We already heard about this, because for a country that, of course, was as agricultural as Algeria, this was seen as a particular threat. Now, let me, and I want to walk you through these historical cases rather quickly, relate already these findings to the situation in the United Kingdom today. Europe's colonial past is central, as I said, in explaining why Algeria and Greenland became part of the EC, and in both cases integration into the European community did not result from the sovereign decision of the people in that specific country, but was determined by the will of the colonial power. And it is, of course, key to stress that the situation in today's United Kingdom is markedly different from this. It formally applied, as you all know, in the early 1960s, was fully admitted in 1973, and since then has enjoyed all rights and, of course, also all obligations of full membership. Still, I find it interesting, if you consider all these fundamental structural differences, that the mix of economic and identity arguments that drove the Brexit campaign has certain parallels with the situation in Algeria and Greenland that I was talking about. In all 3 countries, the specific history, the values, the form of economic and political governance, as well as the society's social fabric, turned into key arguments to withdraw. the ECEU was accused of not accommodating to these differences. And again, it's interesting if you consider that the EC in the 1960s and 80s was still so much less a political entity that also was about other things than the economy. So I think, again, the similarity is striking because the differences are so vast in this context. The desire to regain control therefore unites, I would argue, all these three cases. And this also distinguishes all three of them from the debates that we had in recent years, for instance, of a Greek withdrawal from the Eurozone, which was much more about the incapacity of a state to live up to the commitments of membership. This point, again, which stresses important differences, but also against this difference's similarity, is, I would argue, quite surprises, and we need to bear it in mind for the next steps that I think are even more important than this one. Leads me to the next part of my presentation under the title of Undoing and Reconnecting. This is very much on the processes of withdrawal itself and the dynamics that were unleashed in these contexts. Some 3 months after his aforementioned speech, this is the Algerian President Ben Bella, wrote a letter to the President of the European Economic Commission, the German Walter Hallstein. Given Ben Bella's public announcement, what he wrote must have come as a real surprise to the Commission President, because he requested that despite Algeria's withdrawal from the EC that was publicly announced with big aplomb, existing stipulations should continue to be in force. Algeria was thus, as he wanted, to be treated as if it was still part of the European community. And what did Greenland's Motzfeldt do in parallel to with his Leave campaign? As the island's prime minister, he quickly negotiated an association agreement with the EC. Both countries thus opted for a paradoxical double move, I would argue. On the one hand, they strove for more sovereignty, control, independence, and this was very big in public rhetoric and declarations. And on the other hand, they were highly interested in maintaining close ties to the EC, of course, mainly for economic reasons. And surprisingly, I would think, close ties continued to exist between these two countries also after their withdrawal. Given that Ben Bella wrote his letter on the 24th of December, one might be tempted to speak of a Christmas miracle, at least if you believe in Christmas or in miracles, I should say. In fact, the European community basically accepted Algeria's request. Half a year later, in June 1963, a secret document from the EC Council of Ministers noted that Algeria was, and I quote, treated de facto as a member state of the community. Over the next years, trade barriers rose slowly, but neither side opted for a radical rupture. As late as in 1968, internal EC documents concluded that to this date, there was no clear legal basis defining the relationship to Algeria. That with regard to trade, the country continued basically to be in a legally undefined grey zone, but that was still very close to being part of the EC. Algerian experts arrived at a similar conclusion, with one stressing the both haphazard and paradoxical situation with regard to the European Economic Community. So even several years after having left the community, the disintegrative effects remained surprisingly small, I would say. Greenland also quickly obtained, and this is, of course, as you all know, the flag of Greenland, obtained its association agreement. So also there, close ties were kept. Several member states were highly interested in close links to the island, not least due to its fertile fishing grounds. This holds particularly true for the Federal Republic of Germany, whose fishing lobby pressed the government in Bonn at the time to push this point. Denmark's position was particularly awkward at the time. Since Greenland continued to be part of the Danish realm, it was the Danish government that had to submit the withdrawal proposal to Brussels, even if the Copenhagen government strongly disliked the islanders' decision. The Danish government, therefore, supported the association deal as an attempt mainly to control the damage. And the role of the British government in this situation was, I think, particularly interesting. During the referendum campaign in 1982, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London informally inquired in the Danish capital whether it could help to positively influence public opinion in Greenland. London was afraid that the Arctic example of disintegration might unleash further dynamics of this kind, that others would follow suit. And ironically, as you probably have thought of already a second ago, it was thus the government of Margaret Thatcher the nightmare of every Brussels bureaucrat, that was deeply concerned about the prospects of Grexit and made efforts to avert it. We can talk more about why she did that in the Q&A. And with that, I want to come to a small digression that talks a little bit about the United Kingdom itself, where I just want to have one basic point that I want to share with you. I think what we see today in many discussions is that people linking the Brexit situation and also the strong will in parts of the British people to leave to a long history. That again, the Britons had always been the odd ones out, always been awkward partners, always been unhappy about membership. And I think this picture in the middle with a lady in the somewhat ugly, I would argue, sweater is quite revealing. Again, it's Margaret Thatcher, who in 1975 is campaigning pro-EU membership. It's also interesting, some of you will know, and some even remember this, that the United Kingdom in 1975 held a referendum over continued membership. And if you look there was a clear majority to remain in the European Union, but also if you see which parts of the United Kingdom were more skeptical about memberships and which really wanted to remain in, the landscape is politically fundamentally different to what it is today. So what I want to argue is that we should, again, also, if we look at history, if we try to assess this from a historical perspective, be careful to overemphasize continuities. I think Timothy Garton-Ash, the prominent Oxford historian, was quite right when on the day after the referendum in a Guardian article he wrote that, again, if only a few thousand Britons had kind of voted differently, everybody would probably talk about British wisdom and their cosmopolitan economic nonsensical approach to these kind of questions, which then obviously had to lead to continued membership. And again, therefore, we have to now be careful that we don't rationalize the Brexit decision in just the other way around. Okay, but now going back to the topic directly and more closely, the question, of course, is how the Greenland and the Algeria examples relate to Brexit today, where we stand. Again, I want to argue that, of course, the situation of the United Kingdom today has similarities and differences to these processes in Algeria and Greenland. I need to stress again that worlds separate the scope and the depth of European integration with its acquis communautaire today from the pre-Maastricht and the pre-Lisbon situation of the 1960s and 80s. Economically and geostrategically, of course, the United Kingdom is a giant in comparison to Algeria or Greenland. The international system, of course, has also changed markedly with the end of the Cold War and a new era of insecurity at the international level, where also both the EU and also the wider transatlantic contexts are being challenged. I think we all agree that the details of the Brexit withdrawal are still very unclear today after many months of negotiating. I think they're shockingly and surprisingly unclear. Given that the negotiations started already half a year ago, and again, given that the clock is ticking. But most probably, I would think, even a hard Brexit would not lead to a complete decoupling from the European Union. Prime Minister May has stressed this, that she didn't want the United Kingdom half in and out in her Lancaster speech earlier this year, but that it was a priority, and I quote her, to pursue a free trade agreement with the European Union. And in her Florence speech that you certainly also followed about a month ago, she argued for a kind of longer status quo transition period and stressed the strong interest by the United Kingdom to cooperate again intensely with the EU on non-economic issues such as security, counter-terrorism, or international development. And she stressed again, you all see this picture certainly in front of you still, the shared future of the UK and the European Union. Of course, she was absolutely not clear in what kind of deal she wanted, but argued that the European Economic Area, like with Norway, was not a model, but also not a free trade agreement as with Canada, but rather something in between. By the standards of 2017, negotiations might ultimately lead to something comparably loose if one thinks of what is there as options. Still, I would argue that also now there is an increasing tendency in London to understand that one needs to have rather close ties with the European Union, and that the populist idea of regaining full sovereignty and autonomy is rather fictional. And I'm using this term fictional, which the historians Michael Geyer and particularly Michael himself used already in a classical text from 1889 on the idea of national sovereignty as a European trope in policymaking. So let me be clear. Again, the context between the three cases under study are fundamentally different, but I see an important similarity. The sovereignist rhetoric of the exit camp did certainly not reflect the realities on the ground, and in fact, all political and economic elites in the countries left, therefore, or had to come back to a strong interest to keeping links alive. This brings me briefly already to the next part of my talk, to what happened after leaving the EC of the time. As the cases of Algeria and Greenland reveal, there has never been a default mode of how to leave the ECU. Today, of course, we have the famous Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which has created somewhat of a procedure of withdrawal, but also left a lot of room to decide on the details. How then, of course, is the question in my talk, did Algeria's and Greenland's relationship develop after pulling out? This is really where history has something to tell us. The following assessment will not judge whether the deals were beneficial for one side or the other. For that, I would have to have more time. Instead, I want to examine particularly the intensity of the formal ties to the ECEU as a more straightforward yardstick, you could say, that reflects this presentation's interest, particularly in the political and legal withdrawal dimensions. Okay, exit, I would argue, can be summarized as the trajectory from super soft to a super hard, and from there again to a softer constellation. For several years in the 1960s, the country retained, as I've said, the precarious special deal and status that kept lawyers awake at night. As late as 1968, an internal EC document maintained that its close relations with Algeria still lacked a clear legal basis. With regard to trade, the country continued to float in an undefined twilight area. Increasingly, however, Algeria's privileged position started to deteriorate. As the common market was established and common organizations for the market for more and more specific commodities actually established, there was an increasing realization that Algeria found itself on the wrong side of the fence. The common organization of the wine market, established in 1970, was in fact the hardest blow. Around 1960, and I presume few people know this, the North African country had been the globe's fourth largest producer of wine of all countries. And again, it's interesting because this was a Muslim country, so what they produced was mainly for export. And it was actually also the largest exporter on the whole globe when it came to wine. Wine amounted to half of the country's export, and it was mainly, of course, traded with the EC countries. I can go into the details if you're interested in the Q&A. Now, with the 1970 market organization in the EC, the protectionist common agriculture policy created strong trade barriers that then turned out to be insurmountably high also for Algeria. The government in Algiers bitterly complained about these measures, but to little avail. Meanwhile, the member states' wine producers were very happy, of course, to get rid of their competitors from the southern rim of the Mediterranean. Today, as you might know, Algeria produces hardly any wine at all, and this has not only something to do with the EC, there is also another argument that I can come back to in the discussion. It has to do with independence, but still, it has also quite a bit to do with the EC relationship. In a nutshell, I would therefore argue that Alxit basically led also to an exit, that no alcohol was produced anymore in the country, at least in the longer term. And if you again try to pick up some Algerian wine today, you find that not so easy. It is of comparably low quality very often. And again, I would argue that this is also something that has to do with European integration. Now, this is not the end point of the story. From this low point in the 1970s, EU-Algeria relations have slowly improved in the past 4 decades. Based on several similar agreements, the two partners concluded an association agreement in 2002 and later added further steps. Still, it has long lost the special status that particularly France had insisted on in the early years after independence since 1962. In many ways, it is now treated as any other North African country. The special ties of the colonial past that impacted the first decade have withered away. In contrast, I would argue, Greenland's exit was consistently soft. Despite the concern about foreign fishermen marauding its fertile waters, Greenland immediately agreed to a series of protocols granting the EC excessive access to its fishing zone as a point of negotiation that particularly West Germans insisted on, in return again for this association agreement. Since then, the relations between Greenland and the EU have intensified further. Today, it's one of the EU's overseas countries and territories where primary and secondary EU law applies automatically, though with some derogations. Trade relations are intense, so that ironically, I would argue, Greenland has again started to move much closer to the European Union in comparison to the situation in 1985. Also, if you consider, again, that the EU is a much more intense entity now than it was in the 1980s. In contrast, and that makes the irony complete, devolution within the Danish context has continued, with some activists demanding full independence from Denmark now. So this could ultimately, at some point, lead to a reversal of the dynamics of the 1980s, when again Greenlanders wanted to remain within their kingdom, but disliked the EC. At this stage, of course, it is still unclear what kind of deal the United Kingdom and the European Union will ultimately agree on. Having said this, I think it is rather unlikely that this question will be answered quickly. I think this is something we've seen over recent months, and we've also seen that, of course, in the Florence speech of May, where she wanted to have these 2 transition years. But beyond that, I think, and that is what I have as a main message also in this context, that Algeria and Greenland are reminders that a new settlement is probably only going to be a basis for a next phase, not for a once and for all settlement, not a clear-cut decision forever, but probably there will be many other deals thereafter. So in that sense, I would want to argue that even if you're afraid or hoping for now one big Brexit deal, this will not be the one moment that will decide it all. And I think that therefore history has shown us with these examples. Let me already start moving to my conclusion. I have tried to briefly, very briefly, and for the historians, I know that I've left out a lot of details and context that I would love to share with you in the Q&A. An analysis of the motives, the withdrawal proposals and processes, and the long-term effects. The cases of Algeria, I would argue, and Greenland demonstrate that, again, very fundamentally, withdrawal from the ECEU was not unprecedented. As said before, the integration process has changed massively since the 60s and 80s, and so have the wider European and global contexts. Moreover, the United Kingdom is, of course, very different caliber than the 2 early exiteers. Still, their trajectories, I would think, are revealing. This holds true with regard to the motives, leading the majority of people to opt to leave. In addition, in both these cases, the complex renegotiation process at the exit moment did not lead to a complete unwinding of ties, and again, the long-term trajectories also show that one deal is only the first deal, and there will be more to come. History also reveals that the deal can be very different, that there is not one lesson of how this goes, as I've showed, where again in the Greenlandish and in the Algerian cases you have very different trajectories of how this developed. I think that this taking stock exercise of history has also reminded us of a dimension that has long seemed obsolete, and that is the continent's imperial and to some extent its colonial past. This, of course, was a dimension that was at the core of Algeria's and Greenland's experience, and of course it has also, to some extent, been a little bit in the context of Brexit discussions, where, for instance, Theresa May in January was mentioning former colonies when she said that she was hoping there would be new trade links to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and countries in Africa. I think, again, the question is still very up in the air if some of these former colonies share the same kind of interest, share the interest that the United Kingdom has. But I think there is something more interesting that has to do with a longer history of empire than really linking the 2 cases from my history part to the United Kingdom today. And that is to argue that even if the EU was not always necessarily important for creating peace, undoing European integration can lead us back to conflicts that we've long thought were over, and that often also have to do with the imperial history of the United Kingdom. Gibraltar would be, for me, a very good example, again, which has to do with the 1730 Treaty of Utrecht, where, again, many people have thought, okay, this is a conflict long over, and I would argue that the literature shows that since the mid-1980s, relations between Spain and the United Kingdom over Gibraltar have eased, not because of the EU, but the EU also helped to ease them. It's also interesting if you look at the parallel membership negotiations of the late 60s and particularly the early 1960s between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom to access the EC, it was interesting that the conflict over Northern Ireland played hardly any role. So they were able to decouple something that was fundamentally big in any bilateral discussions from membership discussions in the EU. I would again argue that membership of the EU is not the reason why Northern Ireland and that conflict has calmed down. But I would argue that if again there was again a new situation of Brexit, these conflicts could very well flare up again. So in that sense, I would think that the EC was not necessarily the creator of peace in this context, but a context that helped to stabilize a peaceful situation. And in that sense, a longer history is putting better on our tables. Moreover, I think, again, that if I move to an even more abstract level, that these cases hold an important lesson for the history of the integration process more generally. A careful historical assessment challenges the logic of ever deeper union as a powerful narrative that the EU itself has forged and helped to disseminate for a long time. In this standard story, there is again no place for phases and processes of disintegration, and for this very reason, Brexit is perceived as such a fundamental challenge to the EU. I would argue that, again, these two cases remind us that we also have to look at those cases that often are overlooked, like, for instance, Algeria and and Greenland, and therefore we also have to exit the narratives that particularly these institutions created themselves to understand Brexit and similar cases. Finally, and I didn't say much about law, this are my 2 or 3 law moments that I want to refer to. I think that this talk also has interesting implications for law and the rule of law. The EU itself has always understood itself as a community of law, and I could give you a long list of quotes, starting already with somebody like Walter Hallstein, whom I've referred to, who again argued that this is a legal order, a set system of legal norms, securing the legality of action of the institutions and the legal protection of those who then apply for the norm. But again, I think that the Algerian case has a very interesting lesson for us, because there what you see is that law wasn't really taken into account, that there was an extra legal situation, something that you could even call a state of exception. There is a strand of people who work particularly on former colonies and colonial history, post-colonial scholars, we also call them from their methodological starting point, who would argue that law has often been an instrument of colonial suppression, and that also the state of exception was such an instrument, basically, because it could help then white colonizers, if you will, to basically define when the law would apply and when not. Now, my case with Algeria is interesting because I would argue it was not meant as an instrument to suppress Algeria. Actually, it was helping Algeria in that situation. But the question is why, and I would argue it did not do so mainly for altruistic reasons, that these countries wanted to help Algeria. It was rather because the member states in the European community could not agree on one specific policy on Algeria, where France was more forthcoming because it wanted to keep up some old links with the former colony, and particularly Italy, which of course had a big wine-producing sector, wanted to have a harsher policy and thus profit from the country being fully out. So, to bring this back to the discussion of law, I think what we see is that in the post-Maastricht period, also in the EU today, we often deplore the situation whereby member states do not fully apply that rule of law logic anymore. Hungary and its ECJ kind of positions on ECJ rulings is one example, but if you go to the 1990s, of course, there is also already the idea that countries, member states like France and Germany, were breaking rules in a fundamental way with regard to the euro. But again, these views are often contrasted to the pre-Maastricht period when the house seemingly was still in order. And my argument here is to say that, well, also there history has an important lesson if we look at Algeria, because also there was this state of exception where the rule of law in this fundamentally formative period of the EC wasn't really applied. So in that sense, and to sum up, I want to again argue Brexit can in fact show that this is with these two examples in mind, not the first moment of disentanglement and disintegration in the European Union's history. This reminds us, I think, about how little these two histories I was referring have attracted attention so far, and that even some of the basic facts of the history of integration are at least not really well known in the public discussion. For all the talk about crisis, the European integration process has mastered, and I think that is also quite clear in this story, moments of crisis also with quite some resilience. And in doing so, it has undergone transformations that are quite fundamental. And I would also argue that maybe if you think of that, and if you think that these histories, that were of course quite different, are completely forgotten, also the EU today does not have to worry too much about what is ahead when it comes to Brexit. I want to conclude my real talk here. I want to take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about you as the students in this program at the opening of the academic year. Where is European Studies today? On the day of the Brexit referendum, we at Maastricht University were actually quite sad, and we feared that this is really going to be very bad, and I think we were quite right. And I think it is really bad politically, while it is also forcing us as scholars, as I've tried to show with my presentation also, to ask even more probing questions and to really also challenge some of the ways we've studied European integration so far. But maybe the research challenges are not the main questions that some of you as students have today. You might be wondering, what does Brexit mean to the job landscape that I am in today? What are my perspectives there? And there I would argue, well, maybe Brexit is doing you a great favor, because if this is going to happen, your kind of expertise, be it the more economic expertise, the more legal, the historical, the political science expertise, will be needed more than ever before. And if you read The Guardian, Politico, or any other quality newspaper, I think you will also see many calls where, for instance, it is argued that the British government will need tens of thousands of civil servants to just basically negotiate all the details that are ahead of them. And in that sense, I think your job perspectives, if that is something you should ever worry about, are not as dire as you might think. Actually, I was talking to some of our Maastricht University alumni a few weeks ago, and what they thought about this, and there was somebody doing international property right law, and he said that on the day after the Brexit decision, his company had raised their fees by 10%. So in that sense, I think there is, unfortunately for bad reasons, hope that there is a job market for you out there. Well, if there is happy news, there also has to be sad news. I don't know if there's any Brits amongst you. For those, actually, I do see a little bit of danger. Some of you might know that in the 19th century, the Royal Navy had a very creative way of dealing with shortages in personnel, as the British Civil Service might see in the future, resorting to what was then called Shanghaiing or crimping, i.e. kidnapping people who were sitting in bars or walking around the street with violence, intimidation, or trickery. So let's hope that the British government will not do that, basically, in order to find the expertise that it needs to get the deal done. I should again, and this is the last thing I want to say, add that historians are normally very reluctant to make big predictions, and given the crazy world that we're living in today, I'm more reluctant than ever to do so. Still, I want to conclude by saying that for you, in this institute that you're part of as students, as academic staff, in other functions, I see a very good future, again, not so much for happy reasons, but for reasons that have to do with the fact that the expertise that we're all trying to provide will probably be needed more than ever, and that, again, new questions will probably also arise from these contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, for this inspiring conference. I propose we launch a project about the history of disintegration of Europe from the 50s to today. Now I will take the power pack and just a few reflections about European integration historiography. It's mainly for my students, but I think we can make some connection with what Kiran has just said. Also, I have to be honest, this reflection are born with many discussions with Peter and Kenneth and with other readings, mainly also from an article from Kiran Patel. So for a long time, the European integration history has been perceived as in a state of crisis, unable to overcome its descriptive dimension or its attachment, its affective attachment for the subject. The collaboration of historians to glorify the European integrations or the implication of inside men such as Bino Olivi, Dirk Spirenburg, contribute to suspicious assessments about the writing of European integration history. Yet, historians such as Wolfram Kaiser, Kiran Patel, or Piers Ludlow contribute to renew this historiography. But historians still have to carry this heavy legacy of their predecessor and the way they compromise their discipline in building the institutional and methodological narrative of the European integration. Therefore, it seems that we have to apologize about this legacy and that we are in a permanent work of historical deconstruction. This culpability seems actually so heavy that some historians, just like Laurent Warlouzet, for instance, refuse to talk anymore about European integration history or Histoire de la construction européenne and prefer to use a less normative expression such as the European cooperation history. So I would like to underline three main issues for the writing of European integrations that we have to deal and that we have to share also with the students here in European studies. First, historians are in competitions with many other disciplines in these research fields. That's not specific for European studies, but the competition is very harsh. For instance, one of the most quoted books on the history of European integration was written by Andrew Moravchik, which is a political scientist. And we afterwards suffer many attacks from historians about his methodology and his use of sources. We could say, and some say, who do you think he is to teach us how to write the history of European integration? In addition to this contest historiography, we have to deal also with studies in political science, law, economy, to write a history of European integration and sometimes include their specificities. For instance, it's now impossible to write a paper on the role of experts without referring to the literature or on epistemic communities. It reveals also a kind of inferiority complex of historians, and I guess it's also a part of this heavy legacy. Wolfram Kaiser is a good example of this evolution from a classical and powerful history of European integrations to an attempt to reach a wider audience in using the tools of political science. But please be careful with these tools. It's easy to hurt yourself. Secondly, and it's quite related to the previous point, studying the history of European integrations means studying the archives, of course, a lot of archives, and many copies of the same documents in 4, 5, 6, or even more languages. It takes time to find your way in this labyrinth of sources, and if you want to write a real new contribution to the field of the European integration history, you have to get archives from various national departments, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and so on. So our ability to cross-read the archive, which is one of the best quality, has to be widely extended. In addition to this huge amount of archives and documents, historians and social scientists have to deal with the profusion of comments, analyses, publications on every special event. If you compare the empty chair crisis in '65 with the Greek crisis or the Brexit crisis, I guess the difference will be striking. It's quite the same problem for more recent periods. Soon we will have the opportunity to study the archive for the Delors period or Thatcher archives. And for this period, we also have to deal with the production of other disciplines such as political science or best enemy. An interesting comparison could be done with the study of Ernst Uniting Europe and his famous spillover effect, and how the historians interpret European integrations in the 50s. And this led me to the last point. The European integration history is the study of a living thing, until now at least. So the evolution of European integration has an impact on the way we study the history. In fact, that's not specific to European integration, but still we can observe how the famous democratic deficit led us to condemn the institutional design of Jean Monnet during the 19th and during the last years. Maybe in a few later, the Brexit, and you mentioned that, bring us to see in De Gaulle another founding father of Europe. Every crisis is an occasion to look back to the origins of the problem and to reassess the European integration process. After the Brexit crisis, we are still waiting the actual relaunch, as everyone. And the Catalonia question seems to reinforce the actual crisis. And as Kiran Patel pointed out about Greenland and Algeria, these are two insightful examples for contemporary observers, and the Brexit is a new experience for European integrations. Catalonia and Scotland will be perhaps the next one. A theoretical Scottish independence combined with a Scottish apply for European Union membership will be another new experience or a new chapter in the history of European integrations. Future will tell us if it will be in a form of a crisis or a relaunch. So there are just few comments to open the discussion. Please feel free to ask your question or comments in French if you feel free to do it. Okay, don't censor yourself. Thank you.
Would you like to elaborate, or is that the whole question? Okay.
I mean, Castlereagh, of course, faced a very rambunctious House of Commons behind him. Mm. And that seems to me to be absolutely the parallel between Castlereagh and, of course, Castlereagh had very good relations with Metternich. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are all kinds of similarities, it seems to me, between Castlereagh and the Congress of Vienna and Mrs. May and Brexit. That's all.
Do this right away? Yeah. Again, this is a very nice and big comparison that you're making here. I think when it comes to personnel and links, there might be some superficial similarities, but if you talk about the Holy Alliance, I would see fundamental differences to the situation, can you hear me, the United Kingdom is in today, because again, the situation at the time of the Holy Alliance was still one where, well, you could talk, are these nation states, but still states certainly were by and large very sovereign in what they did. And the level of entanglement, of links of integration running in the economy and also through all other kinds of sectors, but particularly in the economy, I think are so fundamentally deep that even if people might self-fashion or link themselves to historical predecessors, I think the context that they have to be dealing with is fundamentally different. And I think it's, again, in some parts of the British discussion, a problem that people still link themselves to this idea that something like complete autonomy, a full control, and then from that starting point, a full renegotiation of links should be possible. Because I would argue that if you want to do that, many, many years will be needed, and in those years will harm the economy and society also in many other ways fundamentally. And this is where I would see big differences to the early 19th century from the situation that we find ourselves in today. I would, of course, also agree that May is in a very difficult situation. There was a nice article by a Dutch scholar in a German newspaper today that also summarized some of these points that any one of you who reads British newspapers is also well aware of, that, of course, May, on the one hand, is facing a camp that is very much in favor of Brexit, where any soft deal, or maybe even a deal of still remaining in the European Union, which is theoretically not completely impossible, would completely antagonize that kind of camp, and where, of course, her premiership would be completely doomed. On the other hand, I think there is also an increasing attention or awareness in another part of the British political elite and wider public that there has to be a deal, and that the consequences of not having a deal, again, there's 2 articles in Politico that I can recommend to you today on what the implications would be highly problematic for the country. So she's torn in between, and whatever she opts for would basically probably destroy the very fragile political basis that she has at the moment, and the situation of negotiations that don't seem to lead anywhere might therefore continue, and again, it might be tactically wise for her to go on negotiating to that end. But strategically for the country, I think it is highly problematic. And it is also, of course, problematic for the EU, but I would argue that it is more problematic for the United Kingdom than it is for the European Union.
Yes, hello, my name is Jessica. I'm a former student here at European Studies. First of all, thank you very much for this reflection. Quite atypical for political science to have those 2 dimensions put in. But I don't know if it is a question or more of a reflection, but considering what's happening now with these talks that's leading nowhere. David Davis sometimes doesn't know where to lead to. Theresa May doesn't know either. Sometimes she said Brexit is going to be a hard Brexit, and then the other day she's saying no, it's be a soft. What I try to say is UK is very in a problematic situation, especially because of the single market. This is leading for the future, especially for the youth that I am concerned to. So, having compared Algeria and Greenland, how were their situation with the market? Because I know that UK, 70%, what they are dealing in the market is with EU. So how was the situation with Algeria and Greenland at the time? And can it be compared to? Another reflection is also that in the European Commission, Juncker pointed very clearly out, Brexit is not a priority. These negotiations should not take more than half an hour time per week, whereas the negotiations with Algeria was a whole other system. Member states were there to talk together, and they took time to talk it, whereas here it's considered not a priority, and as Barnier is always saying, the clock is ticking, so whatever is happening, you are out in 2 years' time. So I'm very interested to hear your reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant question. I'm very glad that you're bringing this up. Again, I would argue that it is difficult, of course, to fully compare. But if you, I should say, want to compare the situation of my 2 historical examples to the situation in the United Kingdom, you would arrive at both similarities and differences, and that is important to bear in mind. Of course, the British economic structure is very much, as we know, driven by the financial sector, and that was not very strong for very obvious reasons, both in those countries under consideration, which both were very agricultural countries. Having said that, I would want to argue that the economic links were still vitally important for both Algeria as well as they were for Greenland in the situation in that moment of exit. Why so? I've mentioned the example of the wine economy, if you will, where again, it was half of the exports of the country. It was a very important dimension of the economy at the time. There was other things, also oil and so on. But still, this was very much kind of linking the Algerian economy to, again, the northern rim of the Mediterranean, and hence, again, being then cut off from the EC wine market was of very big economic negative consequence. So in that sense, I would argue that there is, at least if you firstly, of course, grant that the economic situation of these countries is fundamentally different, right? And that the geopolitical context is very different, the economic stakes were also quite high there. It might be interesting to just quickly ask what Algeria did in the 1970s, early 70s, when this became clear that knocking on Brussels' door didn't lead you anywhere. What did it do? Well, this is the 1970s, this is the Cold War. What is the default mode for a country in the global south then to do? Well, you go to Moscow. And that's exactly what the Algerian government actually did. And actually there was also a deal on wine with the Soviet Union at the time, but it was too small to really rescue the Algerian economy. So there was, again, a very complex situation, and I think, of course, I would not want to say that Algeria's economic situation and problems were all because of the EC. For that, we have to have many other factors also on top, and again, independence and so on is an important context. But still, I think we see that the economic elites were also really aware of the fact that, again, the stakes were high for them. And similar things could be said about Greenland. Again, it's just 50,000 people. So again, you know, on the one hand, crazy to compare the United Kingdom. On the other hand, also there you had with the fisheries, an economic sector that was also very much linked to the EC of the time, which of course was also economically with the single market, again, the common market of the time, much less integrated as it was then since the Single European Act and later steps. But still, I would argue that the links were high, and even today, 64% of Greenland's exports go to the EC, and 84% go the other way around. So in that sense, the economic links are fundamentally deep. They run deeper than in comparison to the United Kingdom today, where you could say that, again, there is a much more mixed balance, where you have a small portion of trade going to EFTA countries, and basically then half of the big chunks going both to the wider world and the EC. So in that sense, it's quite interesting that some of these small countries were even further integrated with the small economies they had into the EC world of the 1980s then, or the 1960s respectively, than the United Kingdom is today. Now, the other point that you made, I think, about timing and negotiation context, I think is very important. Again, at the time, there was no clock ticking. So there was no need, if you will, to arrive at an answer. Nicola, you already mentioned the crisis of the empty chair, which is, of course, falling into this period, and where also Algerians were wondering if in 1965, second half of the year, there could be any progress. They went to Brussels, and the answer was no, there wasn't any progress, because, again, France was not participating in these negotiations. So in that sense, again, it was, to some extent, looking back, good for the Algerians that these negotiations did not go on, because otherwise probably the problematic effects of being cut off would have kicked in earlier. But there wasn't a kind of schedule of the kind that we have today. And I would argue that, of course, we are living under the yoke of this schedule. We all think that March 2019 will bring a clear-cut solution. Honestly, I still doubt if this is going to be necessarily the case. And again, what I try to do with my talk is also to present and to stress that, again, this one deal that maybe we will see in 2019 or maybe slightly later might not be the one deal forever. And I think this is a little bit the way it's perceived now. This is the one moment where, you know, like in Western movies, the cowboys meet in the middle, and then there is the shootout, and then you have a decision. But I think this is not the way it's going to work, because we see that things are so complex that negotiations will also go on after that moment.
Alexander von Lingen, formerly European Parliament. Of course, us in the institutions who were mainly involved in this, and it happened that my son is in the Brexit unit, and he doesn't speak at home at all about this. but it will last long. I think that Article 50 was a bit naive. 2 years, I don't think that 43 years you can undo in such a short time. And maybe President Juncker was right that he said it's not a divorce because the United Kingdom was never married, really. Let's see how much it will cost the outgoing part of this marriage. And some people argue that in the end, the Brits are good counting people, and they say that if it's too expensive, maybe we should just skip it.
Again, it's difficult to now prophesize and look into the future. And again, historians probably by nature are particularly reluctant to do so, because we are an old discipline, and we know that many of our predecessors as historians have not resisted that temptation and have often been fundamentally wrong in their predictions of what the future will bring. But again, I would be, I think, quite close to your point in arguing that it will probably last longer. And I would still also think that we find ourselves in a situation where it is not fully clear if in the end of the day there will be a Brexit, or if the member state if the United Kingdom will remain a member state. What I see as a very fundamental difference that I didn't mention so far to the negotiations that I mentioned in my presentation is, of course, that they are much more in the public realm today than they were in these two instances that I was referring to. So I think the public pressure to also live up to certain statements, commitments that have been made in public is much bigger now. So once kind of that coast is unleashed and there is a discussion about Brexit, to really get that back away from the public discussion without antagonizing good parts of the population too much will be very, very difficult. And that is, I think, a different situation to the 1960s and the 1980s, where negotiators in the concrete negotiations with the EC, if they came from these two countries, still had a larger room for maneuver to find a deal that economically also didn't kind of harm the country too much. So in that sense, I think we also have to wonder what that factor that, again, so much has been said and so much is out in the public discussion, how that will rub off on the next steps. I think there is also a very interesting story to be told about representative democracy in this context for the United Kingdom and beyond, where again you have a member state where representative democracy has normally been the default mode, and there was a creeping development to now go for a different, more popular form of policy making with referenda. I referred to the one in 75, there is others. Scotland has been mentioned. There is, of course, the famous one that is the backdrop of the presentation today, which also changes British politics and British political culture to a very fundamental extent, where we also have to wonder how this will then impact on these next steps.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan Völkel. I'm working at the Institute for European Studies at the VUB, and I'm grateful that I can also address a question to you. First, just a small thought on the Algerian wine industry. I'm not sure if that is a good example to show the consequences of Algeria leaving the European communities at that time. I have the impression the Algerian wine industries, like it's the case in Tunisia, Morocco, also Egypt, had been exported industries from Europe. So particularly Algeria, French settlers went to Algeria, they set up or promoted wine, and when Algeria gained independence, they simply went back and the links were cut. That is just the short question. The main interest historically is for me, to what extent had the institutions of the European community suffered from Algeria and later Greenland leaving? So were there financial reductions connected to that, as we see with the Brexit negotiations? And were there also experts from their countries that somehow had an influence in the negotiations within the EC? And the last thing, what I missed a bit in your lecture is the idea to what extent can we compare Algeria and Greenland's decisions with the question to what extent are these decisions based on rational decision making? I think Algeria was, of course, highly emotional. We want to be independent. We want to get rid of French occupation and domination. Meanwhile, as you described, Greenland was more rational. Well, we lose more than we win through the fisheries, and how can we reflect this on today's Brexit decision?
Thank you. First of all, I'm very grateful that you bring up the wine example again, so that I maybe have a little bit time to elaborate on this, and I would basically want to support what you were saying. So I do not want to have a monocausal argument whereby, again, the EC and the kind of trajectory of EC relations is the only reason why Algeria ultimately didn't have a wine sector anymore. Again, it is important to remind ourselves that this was a French colony, that settlers from European countries, not only from France, for instance, also from Italy, basically went to this colony and then created this wine industry there. And it was seen also as a symbol of colonial suppression. So in that sense, it's interesting that if you look at the War of Independence, that also the independence army and fighters also destroyed quite a few of these vineyards because of their symbolic meaning as a symbol of suppression. And I think 12 million wine kind of were destroyed in that context. But still, I would argue that quite a bit of it was left. And of course, if we look at the economic trajectory, the loss of knowledge with the pied noir, again, these kind of European settlers then leaving the country, is one factor that also kind of has to be factored into the economic trajectory of the sector. On the other hand, it is interesting that after independence, there is a complete switch in the government's position, and Ben Bella argues consistently, and so did his successors, that we are a wine-producing country and you are harming us. And again, that is quite interesting that the country then bought into kind of the logic of still being a wine producer. And again, it did continue to be rather important. The importance fell already in the course of the 1960s. And again, I would not want to argue that the EC was the only factor, but I would argue that it's massively contributed to the fall of the wine industry in Algeria. The other point that you raised, again, did the EC, if I understood you correctly, suffer from these countries leaving? I would argue that the answer is basically no, and that might also explain why these instances have been forgotten largely, right? Why they're also in the textbooks hardly ever mentioned. And again, I would argue that if it comes to Greenland, let's maybe start with the 1980s, this also has to do because basically the EC member states continued to get what they wanted. This has to do particularly with the German fishery industry that in these association agreements negotiated, and if you look at the details, you can see that quite clearly, that their fishing rights were quite extensive. And in that sense, again, the association deal was also to some extent a deal that was not fundamentally different to what had existed before for Greenland, and therefore it is quite interesting that there was again this big public rhetoric of us leaving, us Greenlanders, and then accepting a deal that economically implied that you were out. Of course, as a small island, you didn't have a big say anyway, but still you were, of course, in a more dependent relationship in comparison to what you'd been before. And again, this might also, again, lead us to the situation today where, again, there is in this very small island an increasing or a certain tendency since the 1990s even to fully join the EU again and maybe decouple from Denmark, so that is quite interesting. Again, there was also levels of expertise being shared, and that is quite interesting. Again, the irony being that in the Greenland case, it was particularly also Danish diplomats, experts, that had to become involved in the exit negotiations because, again, it was part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and these negotiators then still had to do it, even if they didn't want it. And you could then say, okay, this small island doesn't really matter, but I would argue that there we have to consider the context of the time again. I was referring already to the United Kingdom, to Margaret Thatcher and her government themselves basically arguing we don't want this as a precedent because we would fear that this would unleash a whole process of countries leaving. And again, you could argue that this was seen as an argument in its own right, that in this period, the second half or the mid-1980s, where there was something that is often called a new relance of the integration process, the idea of in that moment where the new steps of further integration were still rather vulnerable, having one part leave were meant to be contained and had to be contained. And the other thing that I think we can't forget is that Greenland, while looking almost like a joke on the political landscape, was geopolitically not unimportant in the Cold War context because it's of course also on the transatlantic route that links the United States to Western Europe. So it was not just for kind of arguments that had to do with the logics of European integration, but also with Cold War logics, why it was feared that the country would leave the EC. Again, this was then contained to some extent through the association agreement and of course through the continuous membership in the Danish kingdom. But it explains that the stakes, I think, were slightly higher than we sometimes tend to think. Now, on the last point, and I want to keep it briefly because I've been speaking too long in my answer already, well, I would argue that if you say Algeria was emotional, Greenland was rational, where is the United Kingdom, that I find it interesting, and again, we would have to talk more about the precise mixes, that there is a combination of these more identity-related, if you will, irrational arguments plus economic arguments in all these cases, right? And I would not want to say that Algeria was only emotional, because I think you yourself, with the argument on the wine industry, have also given us an example that there was also economic arguments that helped to explain why Algerians were fed up not only with French colonial rule, but also with what they saw as the EC coming, because of course in 1962 it was just in its early steps. So in that sense, I think, again, this is not a fundamental argument, because the precise mixes still matter, but I would think it's quite interesting that, as we all know, in the British discussion, also irrational arguments and fake news, if you will, were playing a quite important role. So in that sense, the nationalist rhetoric that you might easily associate with a country that tries to become independent is something that we've also seen in this discussion. So in that sense, I'm interested more in the mix, in the blend of arguments, where I see similarities, which I then see as a starting point to then see how these impact on the negotiations. And there I think that it's interesting that public rhetoric and this sovereignist logic and thinking discourses often stayed rather aloof from the concrete negotiations.
Yeah. I have a question on another precedent you did not mention, and that is 2005, when the Dutch and the French government decide to organize a referendum on the constitutional treaty, basically to shut the debate on the treaty, and then the boomerang flies back into their face. But in the end, nothing happens, and it's business as usual. Of course, the question asked in the Brexit referendum is very different. Still, David Cameron gets the same result. He wants to shut up the debate and gets the boomerang back in his face. But this time over, it seems impossible to ignore the popular verdict, as had been the case in the Netherlands and France 12 years earlier. And how do you explain this? And would this not be an indication, after all, that the Brexit crisis is much more a crisis of parliamentary democracy in Britain than a crisis of the European Union?
It's a very good point. I was trying to refer to that a little bit already when talking about the longer history of referenda and popular elements in representative democracy in the United Kingdom. And I want to again argue that, again, the country is torn. So in that sense, it wasn't that 90% of all Brits basically argued they wanted to leave the European Union. So in that sense, I do see, exactly as you argue, a crisis of parliamentary democracy in the United Kingdom. And I see this as a specific British problem, if you will, but also in the sense that the country is so torn, that not everybody wants that, and that the parliamentary system also now still has to deliver in providing a good answer and also mending kind of some of the wounds and overcoming the conflict that this also has led us, or has led the country into. So in that sense, I do see this, as you argue, exactly much more as a problem that is specific to the situation in the United Kingdom, that also has to be kind of linked to the whole question of devolution, to again giving more powers to the regions in the United Kingdom, where the Scotland question was already mentioned, where of course we also see that this is not the end of the discussion, but only the beginning, with not only Scotland, but also the situation in Northern Ireland, where again, Gibraltar, I've mentioned quite a few, so there is more sides than one thinks of immediately, where the question still is what it will lead or mean for the country and its future, basically. I think May was quite right in arguing in her Lancaster speech in January that this is about bringing the four nations of the United Kingdom together again. Again, I think many continental Europeans often think of the United Kingdom as one nation state, but I think also if you look at the vote in the referendum, you see that this is very different places. And that, again, there was a very different regional kind of election or referendum result. Again, I would not want to read that too far back in history, because if I take the 75 referendum, the situation, which parts of the country were for leaving the EC, were quite different to the situation today. I could go into the details, but I'll leave it there. So to just summarize, I would argue you're absolutely right that this is very much a British story. And if you will, it's quite interesting that the EC/EU seems to have overcome these moments of crisis. And again, Algeria was not a small part of France, right? And still it's completely forgotten that it also left the EC. quite easily. So there seems to be something that you could call a resilience. You could also see call it an autism, if you want to see it more critically, that characterizes the EC, that it seems to have mechanisms to overcome these issues. And I think what we also see in the Brexit negotiations today, a certain self-centeredness, right? Again, somebody already referred to Delors saying kind of, this should not kind of keep us busy too much, the whole Brexit issue. We have much more important things to deal with, is something that I also see in these early negotiations, where the EC was really very much then dealing with its own issues and not too much concerned with what the implications for the other side would actually be. Again, one can find this problematic, autistic, if you will. One can also say this is exactly the moment where the union stands together. And I have to say that I was also slightly quite surprised that, again, the remaining 27 member states were able to agree on so many things also without the United Kingdom, that some British politics and tactics to divide the member states amongst each other and do a divide et impera politics, which is nothing uncommon or unknown in British history of doing at the international level, didn't really succeed so far.
Hello. I would like to try to link your outstanding presentation with our discussion about the Brexit, our previous discussion about the Brexit, notably with Cambridge University, with Julie Smith and so on. We are very, very much occupied with the Brexit since several years. The first, I would like to underline the relevance of your conclusions, and particularly two of them, whereas I would like to address a question regarding a third one. Mm-hmm. The one I totally subscribe is that your comparison addressed the question of the necessity to think about subsequent deals, a series of deals, of course after the divorce first, but then I think this is a question to the European Union mainly. The European Union is main political actor in the continent, has to find a way to shape the continent by new, flexible, intelligent, creative institutional framework, more flexible, more capable of including Britain, Turkey, Ukraine, and so on. This is, I totally agree with your, let me say, a concluding remark. Second, I would like to underline how relevant this is, has to do, in my opinion, much more with a British story, as you said. The distinction between rhetorics of sovereignty and authentic sovereignty. And your critical point on the rhetorics of catching back control and sovereignty, I totally underline, is also our conclusion. The point is more problematic, is when you address the question of the need to have a new narrative regarding the European Union. I think I am more optimistic. I think this new narrative is already about to be constructed since at least 20 years as the disciplines are concerned, because you addressed political science and political scientists in particular. And I think that legal studies, political studies, economic studies, already since 20 years consider the European Union as a scientific object of comparative studies, without the teleological and mythical understanding of the first decades. This is, I'm more optimist on this point. You mentioned Haas, you mentioned Schmitter, he mentioned, but this is an old story of the 60s. Even Philip Schmitter has evolved enormously. So I don't see whom I could mention saying that it's in the scientific community, the epistemic community of the three disciplines I mentioned, who is really still linked to the old rhetorics of the teleology of the European Union future. And so, taking stock of your presence here, of an eminent historian contributing to our reflection, I would like to address two questions very shortly regarding the British story, in the British side of the story. The first one is one of the balance we drafted is that the Brexit is also bringing evidence about the disastrous record of the instrumental rhetorics about membership of the European Union. So we have had, since the 70s, an instrumental approach to the European Union. European Union is good because we can get money through the access to the European market. With this kind of rhetorics, the people's support declined from the majority of 75 to the minority of today because of the poor and weak discourse by the anti-Brexit front in the United Kingdom. Do you share this historical negative balance of how the British elite, with few exceptions, presented to the public the European Union for many decades? This is the outcome. And secondly, let's take stock of an historian of your level, illustrating us how relevant is the new discourse of Theresa May about the Victorian rhetorics about the global Britain for the 21st century. The historical dimension of Brexit is also about the rhetorics of the revival of the British old Victorian rhetorics of the global Britain. I would like to really to take stock of your presence here for illustrating this side. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks for these very stimulating points. Let me maybe first, before I come to the two questions that you asked specifically, briefly address the third point in that list that you made on studies and where we stand taking stock of the field. I would fully agree with you that, again, we have long overcome a very narrow teleological normative overdrive form of European integration studies. But what I still find interesting, and again, Schmitter I quoted as one of the exceptions, because he is also in the Journal of Common Market Studies article thought about disintegration systematically. I think beyond kind of moving to issues like comparative politics, more recently maybe also comparative regionalism, we have tons of people who study European integration, and they call it that, right? And there is very few and very little thinking really about disintegration. There is, of course, flexibility. This is a discussion of the 1990s and so on, differentiation, but still forms of disintegration. And I would call these examples that I've given tonight forms of disintegration. And I would also have others in other policy fields where I think if you take a definition of disintegration that you have a certain status quo, maybe with the acquis there, and then that disentangling again, this has happened. And there I would still think that we're all invited as a community of scholars in European studies to push ourselves harder and to think more how to also conceptualize, theorize, operationalize research that factors that in. That is where I see one of the frontiers of research, which I think hasn't been fully addressed, but maybe it's also my ignorance of what's going on in some of the other disciplines, in fields like comparative studies and also regional comparativism, for instance. On your specific questions, I would fully agree that there is a dimension of a very instrumental rhetoric in the British approach to European integration, and I think this is also what studies of media analysis on the United Kingdom have shown. I would, however, do not want to turn that into a too monocausal argument, because if you look, for instance, at the Times, of course, a newspaper that is much less important now than it was still 30, 40 years ago, you have, for instance, in the 1970s, a very interesting turn in its stance vis-à-vis the European communities. And a man by the name of William Maugriez, and his son is probably somebody whom some of you might know as now a backbencher, who is sometimes even mentioned as one of the successors, potential successors of Theresa May, was one who then also in the late 1970s, as the editor of the Times, wrote an article and no, we have to be in favor of this thing. And again, we have to have a different take on European integration. So in that sense, I think there is a story of a rather continuous happiness and unhappiness with the integration process, but there are also other elements. I would argue that the dimensions that you highlighted of this instrumental rhetorical approach have been there forever, but also gained traction more recently, to an extent that, again, the anti-Brexit, the Remain camp, also was trapped in that rhetoric track, basically, that they were also only speaking about these instrumental needs, and I think that was a fundamental problem, that was the only way the discourse was framed, if you will. So in that sense, I would agree with you, but I would argue that we should be careful if we go really further back in history. Now, Global Britain, and I'm really also grateful for you to bring that up, I think, again, it's very different what different people in the United Kingdom associated with it. And having family also in that country, of Indian origin, obviously, I also try to follow that quite closely. And I think it is amongst some white English politicians, of course, an idea to go back to these 19th century pseudo-Victorian reveries, if you will. And there is this also, including some racist dimensions of going for a specific xenophobic notion also of what this nation should be about. And I think we've also seen, particularly also in anti-Polish resentment and also aggression on the street, that also materializing itself, and that was also given more space due to public rhetoric by some of the leading politicians in the country. So in that sense, I think that is highly problematic. There is some, and again, I would argue, is at least flirting with that kind of pseudo-Victorian rhetoric. I wonder still in how far this will fly, and if there isn't enough awareness in the country, also enough common sense, basically, to understand that the world has moved on and that the world isn't waiting for the United Kingdom to take the lead, if you will, and to pull the world into a good direction. I think the decision also by Donald Trump on Bombardier might also make people think in the United Kingdom. Again, those of you who didn't follow this so closely, this is, of course, one of the big British Canadian producers. This is about aircraft, and the Americans were complaining that, again, they were doing unfair trade practices. Again, Britain, I think, was always hoping that under a President Trump, they would get a particularly good deal with the United States. I think now this is a moment where also British economic elites can realize that if you're a small little island, maybe with a nice Canadian friend, you're too small, basically, to also weather the storms in transatlantic trade negotiations, and that probably Airbus is on safer grounds, because this is not just France or Spain or Germany, but this is the European Union, and that also somebody as, I think, arbitrary and difficult to read as Donald Trump will think twice before he starts a real trade war with then an industry and a company as big as Airbus.
Much. So just a few brief words to conclude, if you allow me. And first of all, to congratulate you for this brilliant opening lecture. I think we really appreciate it a lot. I am a lawyer, and I found it really extremely interesting. I learned a lot, I must say. Many thanks also to Nicolas and to the Department for History of the Faculty of Philosophy and Social Science. Et enfin, Ramona Coman et moi-même, nous souhaitons remercier très sincèrement l'équipe de l'Institut d'études européennes et en particulier Maria-Isabelle Soldevia, Dominique Dambourg et Michela Arcarese. Et enfin, il nous revient le plaisir de vous inviter tous à prendre un verre ici à côté, et ça nous donnera évidemment l'occasion de continuer les discussions passionnantes que nous avons eues. Merci beaucoup. Un tout grand.